Huh.
Watching Kyle's unboxing videos again?
Yeah, he always finds the coolest... No way! A robot dog? Gotta ask where he got it.
Or use your Samsung Galaxy S24 Ultra. Just draw a circle around the dog on your screen, and it shows you where to buy it right in the app.
Whoa, I just learned a new trick. And that for once, I beat Kyle to the next big thing.
Circle it, find it with the new Galaxy S24 Ultra and circle the search with Google. Get yours now at Samsung.com. Internet connection required. Results may vary based on visuals.
Hello, Duke fans, and welcome to episode 388 of the Duke Basketball Report podcast. It is Tuesday morning, February 8th, 2022, and Duke lost a close game, the closest of games. It was a 1-point victory for the Virginia Cavaliers in Cameron last night, 69-68 on what's effectively a buzzer beater for Reese Beekman, a three-pointer that gave UVA the lead. It was the first time in the game that UVA even was considered the favorite, according to Ken Pomeroy. We will get into all of that. I am your host for this episode. I am Sam Klein. I am joined by Jason Evans and Donald Wine, as I always am. I guess, Donald, how are you?
I'm tired. We're recording this at like 8:15 because we're gluttons for punishment. We have to get up here and talk about this frustrating game. But that's what we're here for.
Jason Evans is also here, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, Donald said it pretty well. Frustrating. I'm angry. Not angry that Duke lost, but angry that I thought Duke didn't play with much intensity. They I hate to say it because I almost never feel this way, but Virginia deserved to win. I think there's little question about that.
All right, so let's talk about the details of this game. And of course, we also have to spend a few minutes at the end re-previewing Clemson. I think I hosted the last time we previewed Clemson and told you we're just going to keep previewing Clemson until the heat death of the universe this season. Mm-hmm. So I guess we'll start with headlines. Jason, I'll let you go first on your headline. What'd you have in Duke's extremely close loss to Virginia?
Hardworking Cavs down, overconfident Duke.
I like that. Donald?
Closed mouths remain unfed and letdown loss for Duke.
I merely had whiplash. That's it. Just whiplash.
Yeah. Hey, we got one from the K-Man. Did you see we got one from the K-Man?
No, what did the K-Man say?
David Kerman said, Devils hungover get hosed at home by who's. A lot of alliteration there.
Ooh, the alliteration.
He knows we like the alliteration.
Yeah.
Thank you, K-Man. I appreciate that. All right, guys, we're still going to do the good and then the bad, as we often do. But something tells me that the amount of time that we spend in those sections relative to each other is going to be somewhat different than it was after the Carolina game. So, Donald, give me a good from this game between Duke and UVA.
I don't want this good to get lost, so I'm going to start with it. Bates Jones came off the bench, and I thought when he was in the game, provided a lot of energy, things that were missing. He hit 2 threes. Those were 2 shots of the game, and they were crucial threes. But also, it was funny. I was joking with my best friend during the game. I'm like, I did not expect to see Bates Jones in this game, like at the 10-minute mark of the first half, but that's kind of what we've been seeing him enter games in the past few weeks. Him coming in, basically since we discussed him right before that Syracuse game, we've seen him appear earlier and earlier in games. And it's not because of things necessarily going bad, but because of what he's contributing on the floor. So I want to start by shouting him out because I thought he had a good night when he was on the floor. And
Duke was down in the first half to UVA. I said that the win probability still favored the Blue Devils, but Duke was down by like 10, 12 points there in the first half. So Coach K was looking for a spark and was clearly not getting it from his guys. Jason, any good other than Bates Jones that you want to highlight?
Yeah, so I sort of was going to I thought the whole bench. It wasn't just Bates Jones. I thought Theo played a lot more minutes than he usually does. because Mark Williams is in foul trouble. And I thought Theo, looked pretty good. I thought Trevor Keels, it felt to me like he was closer to his old self than we've seen. In a game where Duke seemed pretty tentative, Trevor was the guy who was taking the ball taking it hard to the basket down the stretch over and over and over again. And he wasn't super successful, but he wasn't unsuccessful at it either. He created opportunities for himself or for others. He ended up with 4 assists, 12 points in a game where Duke struggled to score points. He drew 4 fouls on UVA, and Trevor Keels ended with a team leading plus minus of +9. Anytime there's a guy who puts up a +9 in a game where your team loses, that opens your eyes a little bit. You're like, oh, hey, what was he doing that was so different from everybody else? So I thought our bench play was pretty strong. It was pretty good. I don't want to segue too much into the bad, but I'm not sure anyone other than the bench had a good game. So I got to shout out the bench guys. By the way, one other interesting thing just to note was that usually if you're talking about Duke's bench contributing, you'd be talking about Joey Baker. Joey only played 2 minutes in this, not quite 2 minutes in this game. He had a nice shot in the lane that he hit. Wasn't necessarily a great shot, but he knocked it down. But it was like Joey couldn't even get it in the game. I think maybe because Bates Jones was playing, better than expected, and so Bates was getting more minutes than Joey was. But our bench play was my only good thing from this game.
I also wanted to highlight the Cameron Crazies because they were great yesterday. The atmosphere in Cameron was good despite the process and the outcome that was happening on the floor. So, I'm sure that everybody was fired up after the Carolina game. And I was with you guys. I'm not sure that there's much from the starters that we need to highlight. So why don't we talk about the bad?
I will note real quick on Mark Williams. He led the team with 16 points. He was one of 2 guys in double figures. And if memory serves, I think this is the first time this year that he has led the team in scoring. So when we're talking about the stats game, someone could double check me on that, but I thought there was one where he was like close, but didn't actually get it. But I will say, despite everything, despite being in foul trouble, leading the team in points, means that he was active under the basket. And, we've talked about him. He had 3 blocks. Theo John had 3 blocks, and also Paulo Banchero had 3 blocks. So, leading with him when he was in the game, I think our defense fundamentally changes, even with Theo John playing, pretty good. It's just that they went after Theo John in the way that they can't go after Mark Williams because Mark Williams is taller than everybody else on the floor. And so when he was there, I think that's why their focus was to try and get him out of the game, because it does change that interior defense significantly.
How crazy is it that Duke blocked 9 shots in a game where we absolutely got dominated in the paint? It's right. It's like insane.
Well, the reason that happened is that, and maybe this is part of our transition to the bad, but UVA was attacking the rim, right?
Yes.
UVA was attacking the rim yesterday. They really couldn't until right at the end. UVA could not make a 3 to save their lives, and Duke was hounding them off the 3-point line again for most of the night. So what was UVA doing? Being the well-coached team that they are, they were going into the paint, and yes, we're going to get blocks when teams are shooting most of their shots in the paint, but we're also going to give up layups, or at least Duke's going to give up layups if they're not being careful about the way they're playing defense in the interior. By the way, before we fully transition to this topic, Donald, you are correct. Yesterday was the first time that Mark Williams led the team in scoring this season. So if you're counting at home, we've now had Mark Williams, Paulo Banchero, of course. He's led the team in scoring in almost every game. But Trevor Keels has a couple. Wendell Moore has a couple. And AJ Griffin has a couple. So I think that's 5 now guys on this team that have led the team in scoring. Jeremy Roach doesn't have one yet, nor do any of the other sort of lower in the rotation guy players. But anyway,
Joey Baker came. I feel like Joey Baker was like our second leading scorer in one game. He came close.
He has come close, and he certainly has the ability to, if he just has that game where he decides to, hit 7 3-pointers, which we know he's capable of. He just hasn't done yet. Okay. Can we talk about Duke allowing points in the paint? I feel like this is the main topic of the game today, right, Jason?
Yeah. I mean, I don't understand how, what are their names? Caden Shedrick and
Oh, I didn't like him.
Francisco Cafaro. What? How did these guys just dominate Duke in the paint? What the heck was going on? It was really, really, it was just frustrating. Easy shots to me were one of the big keys in this game. And Virginia would get the ball in the lane, they'd get the ball around the basket, and they would finish. And Duke just didn't. Duke repeatedly missed shots at the rim. They missed wide open 3-pointers. I mean, AJ Griffin, who 48 hours ago Sam was calling our best offensive player, couldn't even hit a wide open dunk. AJ had a dunk at one point, and there was no one really near him, and he just clanked it off the back of the rim.
That moment felt like
that was when that was the moment I thought Duke was going to lose. I was like, oh, we're going to lose.
Yeah, exactly. Normally,
that's the frustrating part.
Win. I usually think Duke is going to win right until they lose. At least in a game where things are close. I typically think Duke is going to pull out the victory. I even thought that they put a few extra ticks back on the clock after Beekman's last 3 yesterday, and I was like, this is great. Duke is clearly going to win this game after all of that stupidity. But the moment where AJ Griffin missed the dunk, I was like, what is going on here tonight? As you said, Jason, the offensive ineptitude, and I guess we're switching away from UVA's points in the paint and talking about Duke's offense a little bit. Duke's inability to get to finish, that was part of it, but also Duke's inability to get good shots. I know that UVA has, the defensive fundamentals, but we talked in the preview about how this UVA team is not, peak Tony Bennett vintage. They don't execute the defense as well, or at least they don't normally execute the defense as well as they have in previous seasons. But it felt like they were running Duke off of good spots. Paulo Banchero was not getting the ball in advantageous positions a lot last night. UVA was, if not completely shutting down his game, forcing him into slightly less efficient places on the floor to receive the ball, not allowing Paulo to take advantage of the one-on-one, of the isolation, which he's been so good at this season. They reclog the lane and make him take a mid-range or a long-range jumper. And you just lower those percentages a little bit for Duke and you raise them a little bit for UVA. And all of a sudden this is a UVA victory.
Yeah. Duke hits 42% of their field goals in this game. And our 2-point field goals, we didn't connect on our 2-point field goals at all in the way that we're supposed to. And UVA, credit to them about this, but this is a bad because Duke needs to figure out a way to adjust. They were doubling Paulo a lot. Like as Paulo would get closer to the lane, UVA would send someone to double. And he was doing a decent job of finding his teammates. He ended up with 3 assists. But Duke needed to knock down those baskets more when Paulo got rid of the ball. I thought Duke had 3-pointers. I mean, wide open 3-pointers. They just clanged off the rim, and we had the right guys taking them.
Duke also suffered, by the way, Jason, Duke also suffered from coughing the ball up against that UVA pressure.
Well, yeah, UVA, I was going to get to that. My favorite
UVA had 10 steals yesterday. Duke turned the ball over 15 times. So UVA was creating the pressure and making Duke uncomfortable. It's actually somewhat surprising that I don't think we've seen more of that double teaming on Paulo and more of the, aggressive defense against Duke this season, because I think if we going into this game were to point out like one of the flaws that Duke has, AJ Griffin has stopped a little bit of this, but Duke doesn't have that many reliable offensive weapons. So you can, against the Blue Devils, double on the guys who really are key offensive threats for Duke and frustrate them, which is exactly what UVA was trying to do.
So really quick, I was about to say my favorite stat, field goal attempts, because of those 15 turnovers, because Duke and UVA basically were even on the offensive boards, and UVA is not usually a good offensive rebounding team. So Duke, that's a negative for Duke for us to be even with them. But because of those turnovers, and UVA only committing 5 turnovers, they outshot us. UVA took 65 field goal attempts to only 52 for Duke. Now, a little piece of that is the fact that Duke went to the free throw line more than UVA did. And we were this was actually a game, one of the few positives. We should have mentioned this in the good. Duke when Duke was struggling to score, they got to the free throw line and they converted those free throws. We hit 81% of our free throws. That's a good number. But if you get outshot by 13 shots from the field, you're going to have to shoot a high percentage. And Duke did not shoot a high percentage. The math is easy. If you take more shots, you're probably going to win unless you don't shoot well. Duke took less shots and Duke didn't shoot well. You can't win in that circumstances. It's frankly a miracle looking at some of the stats. It's shocking that Duke only lost this game by 1 point.
So there's a lot of things that I can combine into very, just one sentence. And honestly, I didn't even say it. This was something that Coach K said in his post-game press conference. UVA was hungrier. Full stop. They were going after every loose ball. They were taking the game to us as opposed to sitting back. I know the pack line defense is one where you're supposed to sit back and let the offense kind of mess it up, but they were taking their game to us, not the other way around. And in Cameron,
like I said, they deserve to win. And that should be our bottom line.
Yeah, we were sloppy. We obviously had a letdown from the UNC game over the weekend. And there's all these intangibles that just little things that just made the difference. You pointed out the free throws. You pointed out the turnovers. It was just sloppy. Even and here's the thing. Here's the mental thing, right? When we got to we were up 12, or we were down 12 late in the first half with 2:18 left in the first half. UVA hits a 3-pointer. We're down 12. And from there, we started clawing back ever so slightly. We'd get to within 1, and then we'd hit a wall. They would make a couple of layups. Then we're down 5. We'd get back to within 1. It seemed like that barrier was won. So late in the game, when we finally took the lead, I told my friends, hey, if we've been trying to bust through this barrier for the entire game. We finally busted through. Now we got to hold it. We've talked about this part before. Our end of game execution, our end of half execution has been awful the entire season. It's the one black mark I would say that we have. We have some things that we do well or just maybe be inconsistent. But this is one that we consistently do not do well, and that's the end of half or end of game execution. We just don't have the plays, or at least the guys are not getting into position to make plays. I mentioned that 3-pointer that UVA made with 2:18 left in the first half. The only other 3-pointer they made in the game was the one with 1 second left. It's just is what it is when it comes to that. But for us, it's about sloppiness. It's about playing lazy, and it's about the other team wanting it more than Duke, which is very rarely done in Cameron Indoor Stadium.
Donald, I want to talk about that final play. Not just the final play, but the final minute or so of the game. Because Duke now lost 4 games this season by a total of 9 points. That takes hard work.
And all 4 of those games, we were ahead with under 2 minutes to go. At some point within the last 2 minutes, we were ahead, and we lost all 4 of those games.
In the 3 ACC games, we had a lead in the final minute in all 3 of those games. In fact, I could be wrong, but I think Duke had the lead and the ball in the final minute of each of those games and failed to close it out. Because those are situations, if you have the lead and the ball in the final minute, pretty much if you can get a score, you're going to win. And Duke has failed to score every single time in those situations. In this game, it was Paulo Banchero, who, frankly, to me, looked afraid to shoot. He takes the ball in the lane on Duke's final. I guess it's Duke's final possession, even though they got one more possession when they threw up a desperation 3. Duke's final real possession. Paulo drives to the middle, and I thought he actually got to a point where he could put up a shot, but he chose not to. He chose to make a pass in the lane instead. There are 5 bodies in there. The ball gets knocked around, and UVA ends up coming out with it. And his decision not to shoot there was disastrous, in my opinion. But what I really want to get to is the actual final play, because Duke played good defense, I thought, down the stretch. I mean, the reason Duke got back in this game was they kept Virginia from scoring, and Duke slowly clawed their way back when Virginia had a lead throughout the entire second half of this contest. And on the final play, this is going to seem crazy. I think Mark Williams didn't know what defense Duke was playing. I think Mark Williams thought Duke was in his zone, not in a man-to-man. Because if you watch that final play, Reese Beekman is inbounding the ball, and Duke has put Mark Williams on the guy who's inbounding the ball, which makes sense. Mark is long. He's tough to see around. It makes it harder for that guy inbounding the ball. As soon as Reese Beekman inbounds it, Mark Williams leaves him and goes to the middle of the zone. He goes under the basket. He goes to the paint so he can protect the rim. There's nothing wrong with that, but the problem is it means no one's guarding Reese Beekman. And so Reese Beekman inbounds the ball, and it's always said in basketball, the most dangerous guy in an inbounds play is the guy who's passing the ball in. He then walks out to the 3-point line. No one from Duke pays any attention to him. No one's close to him. And so Kihei Clark passes him the ball, and he has time to tie his shoes, check the weather, do everything else before hitting the game-winning 3-pointer. At first, I thought it was Jeremy Roach's fault because Jeremy Roach is like trying to fight around a screen in the post. Jeremy Roach, for some reason, is guarding Virginia's tallest player. And I was like, oh, how did Roach get stuck there? It wasn't Jeremy Roach. It was that Mark, if you watch the replay, which I did at least 5 times, Mark Williams just walks away from Reese Beekman and leaves him completely all alone. So between Paulo not taking a shot he should have taken in the lane, although it's worth noting he's knocked off balance because the refs were allowing Virginia to interfere with our drives. With when Duke got the ball, Virginia uglied up the game. That's what they wanted to do. But on the final play, I think frankly Mark Williams makes a mental mistake. I think he thought Duke was in his zone because there's no other reason for him to completely leave his man and go cover no one.
Jason, remember a couple of weeks ago when you tried to ask Coach K a question about Paulo Banchero not seeing the ball for the first 15 minutes of the second half, and it was kind of a cripply little answer? Do you want to know the first time Paulo Banchero took a shot in this second half? The last play of the game.
Exactly. Yeah. Although, that wasn't the same as that Florida State game where Paulo didn't touch the ball. He was touching the ball. It was that Virginia, like I said, every time he tried to move with the ball, Virginia was putting a body on him, knocking him off his spot, double teaming him and forcing him to pass. So it's Virginia to me that caused Paulo to have the bad second half, not Duke. Against Florida State, it was Duke that caused him to have a bad second half. But Duke has got to figure out a way. If a team's being physical on Paulo, he's a big guy. We should be able to figure out a way to be physical back and take advantage of them double teaming him and all that other kind of stuff. And that's that to me was the story of the game, was that when Paulo would get the ball, he couldn't get a shot, and Duke didn't get a good shot out of his passing out of the double teams.
Jason, going back to the final play, because I appreciate you breaking it down for us. What was surprising to me is that Duke, not just Mark Williams, but that the team in general didn't have as much of a focus on stopping the 3-pointer, because that's, UVA was, of course, trying to get that to end the game and not have to go to overtime and deal with the crowd and the atmosphere and everything. So how Duke was not focused on having guys in the perimeter. I don't know if that's just a Mark Williams problem or that he read the defense wrong, as you said, like he didn't know which defense we were playing, but it wasn't just Mark Williams. I think that the whole team needed to be on higher alert for the 3-pointer in that instance.
Well, yeah, they're going to take a 3. Think about the percentages. So even though UVA was having a terrible game from 3, most teams are about 30% to hit a 3-pointer. So at that point in the game, you can either take a 2 and, maybe you're 50, maybe you get a really good shot, you're 60% to hit that 2 and send the game to overtime, where in theory you're 50-50, or you have a 30% chance to win by taking a 3. Every team in that situation probably takes the 3-pointer. Maybe if you think you're clearly better in those extra 5 minutes, you'll be able to assert that you're better. But for the most part, teams take a 3 there because the odds say that's your best chance to win. And I actually thought, Sam, Duke was guarding all the other 3-point shooters. It was just the guy who inbounded the ball that Mark Williams walked away from.
Right.
That was the guy who got open. I can't blame the rest of the team for that. And to be clear, I'm not saying it's Mark's fault that we lost or anything like that. But on that last play, the reason Reese Beekman is wide open is because Mark Williams doesn't bother to guard him, and no one else on Duke guarded him. And I don't, teams play defense together, but I don't think anyone else is supposed to guard him.
Duke has now lost 4 games this season by a total, I think, of like 10 points.
9 points.
9 points.
Yeah.
In ACC play, Duke has 3 losses, 2 of which are at home. But in the context of last season, just losing 2 home games is really okay for Duke. They're on the way back up, and hopefully there are no more this season. But in the 3 ACC losses, Duke has lost by a total of 4 points. So, I think that the execution in this game was pretty poor for Duke. Hopefully they can learn from this. My immediate reaction to this game, after being frustrated that Duke's offense was not able to figure out Virginia's defense here, is, man, there are so many learning opportunities that are coming out of this for Paulo to learn how to deal with the double team, for Duke players to deal with, not having the shots fall, and all the bad stuff. I feel like is hopefully things that Duke can recover from down the stretch.
Yeah, and honestly, I will say this: this is not a sky is falling moment. This is probably the most frustrating loss in my mind that we've had this season. But this is still not a sky is falling moment because of what you just said, Sam. All these games, as bad as we played last night, as frustrating as that game was, we lost by 1 point. As frustrating as that game was against Miami, we lost by 2 points. We lost by 1 against Florida State. We lost by 2 again in overtime. Yeah, it took overtime to do that. So there's little things that here or there, again, if we execute a one play here, if we make a stop here, we're winning that game by 10 as opposed to losing by 1. These are little things that we can work out now. Obviously, we want to work them out now and not have to worry about this in March or April. But these are little things that make me believe the sky is not falling, because after all that, we are still one of the top 10 teams in the country. And it took all of that effort just to beat us by 1 point. That's where we are at this moment.
Yeah. And I mean, Paula Banchero and AJ Griffin, who might be Duke's 2 best players. I think probably at least 2 of our 3 best players, along with Wendell Moore, had arguably their 2 worst games this season. I'm not counting the games early in the year when AJ was coming back from injury and wasn't really playing. Since AJ started playing, this was his worst game. And I think over the course of the entire season, I think this is probably Paulo's worst game. So 2 of Duke's best players, 2 of our 3 best players, arguably our 2 best offensive players, have their worst games of the season, and Duke still only loses by 1. So that's encouraging. By the way, AJ, do you see AJ's plus minus? AJ Griffin's plus minus was minus 15.
Which is unheard of, considering that he's usually one of the guys that leads the team in plus minus.
Yeah.
And it was a 1 point game.
Right. Exactly. I mean, it's tough to put up a negative 15 in a 1 point game when you're a starter. That's not great. Okay. So speaking of learning from this loss, speaking of close games in ACC play, and speaking of teams that Duke has already played this season, there's too many points of transition here. Duke gets Clemson on Thursday night in Littlejohn. This is a makeup game from the game that was canceled or postponed earlier this season because of COVID issues. We are going to preview that game very briefly. Of course, Duke has already played Clemson, but we're going to talk about that a little bit right after this quick break. So as we mentioned in the discussion of close games, Duke played Clemson just a few weeks ago. It was a game in Cameron that Duke won by a mere 71-69 margin, despite Clemson being, similar to a lot of other teams in the ACC on the wrong side of the bubble, according to all the advanced metrics. Duke gets another shot, or I guess the Tigers get another shot at Duke this Thursday in Littlejohn. Duke is on the road there in a place where in recent seasons, I think Duke has been a little bit better, but there is some terrible history in Littlejohn for Duke. So we're hoping that the Blue Devils avoid a losing streak. I want to start with Donald here in the preview for Clemson. We don't have to be maybe as detailed as we were the first time around, but Donald, what has happened to Clemson since that game in Cameron a few weeks ago?
Yeah, so right now, or since we last faced them on January 25th, Clemson has beaten Florida State and they've lost to Georgia Tech. They play UNC. We're recording on Tuesday, February 8th. They play UNC at home tonight. So they will be operating off of short rest. So for us, I think Coach K is probably going to want them to get back to the basics of what, coming together as a team. We're going on the road, someplace that, the road, again, after the UNC game, Jason and I and Sam, we talked about the fact that we had just won 3 road games in a row and that this team had come together in a way they hadn't so far this season. They need to get back to that. They're going into a gym that, as you mentioned, we don't play well. And we have to come out with the hunger and the fire and the intensity and the desire that we did when we were on the road for the last week and a half before coming back to Cameron last night. So that's what I want to see from Duke. Again, Clemson came in with the same intensity that UVA did, and we barely beat them. We need to bring that intensity to them in Littlejohn. And if we do, we should be able to win this ball game by about 6 or 7 points at least. But Clemson is a team that always gets fired up for this game. This will be no exception. Jason, I know you're planning on being in the building on Thursday, so bring a little bit of that mojo, will you?
I will do my best. I will definitely try. Yeah, it's not 100%, but I'm probably going to be up there sitting on press row watching Duke play Clemson. It's a pretty easy drive from Atlanta, just waiting on approval of my press credentials. This Clemson team, they are guard oriented. And I think, we already saw they present some challenges for Duke. They're an excellent 3-point shooting team. They hit 38% of their threes. They don't turn the ball over very much. They're a good passing team that gets a lot of assists. They attack the rim, which means they get their shots blocked a lot. But they're a tough matchup, I think, for Duke. The one thing I think that is really different from last time that we need to point out is that Hunter Tyson, who is their power forward and a very experienced player and a big part of what Clemson does in the game, is injured and almost certainly will not be playing in this game. And it really changes their look up front. Clemson's not a particularly deep team, and they get even more shallow without Hunter Tyson. He was the guy who guarded Paulo Banchero most of the last game. They're just, Clemson's going to struggle to have a guy who can match up with Paulo quite as well. It's probably going to be Naz Bohannon or Ian Schifrin or Shiflin. I can't even pronounce that guy's name, who will match up with Paulo. And those guys are just not, they're just not Hunter Tyson. That's just, as simple as it is. And Duke's big men gave Clemson trouble last time. Paulo had 19 and 7. Mark Williams had a double-double. I think, without Hunter Tyson, our size becomes an even bigger problem for Clemson this time around. And then the other guy, it's worth noting, who had a good game last time was Joey Baker. He scored 11 points, hit 3 of 4. I think it was 3-point field goals. Joey's seen his role on the team diminish a little bit more. Bates Jones has been getting more and more time and getting more time than Joey. It'd be nice for Joey to get a bounce back kind of game. And then the last thing I want to mention about Clemson, and this is kind of interesting. They play Littlejohn's a small Coliseum for the ACC. It's even smaller than Cameron. And their crowd gets pretty rowdy there. Clemson actually has one of the best home court advantages. The difference in playing Clemson at home and on the road is a big deal. Ken Pomeroy actually tracks, sort of your results at home versus your results on the road. And what does that say about your home court advantage? He says that Clemson has the 25th best home court advantage in all of college basketball. That's a big deal. He says that they're about 4 points better at home than they are, in a neutral stadium. So, this gives Clemson, this is a game that Clemson's going to feel like they have a chance to win. Especially, they'll have confidence from the last game where it came down to the last possession. And, I really hope that we see a confident and aggressive Duke, not the Duke that we saw against Virginia that was tentative.
Duke, I think, has a clear advantage over Clemson in terms of size and physicality in this game. Clemson has PJ Hall, who's a big guy, but he's not an imposing sort of interior threat. He's more of a shooter than he is an interior player. And I want to see Duke, and especially, Jason, you mentioned Tyson being out. I want to see Duke exploit the size advantage. Trevor Keels didn't play in that first game against Clemson. He was still out. He was hurt. He's back now. Duke has everybody else healthy, and I want to see. And AJ Griffin didn't have a great game against Clemson. I think in his, in his recent emergence as a key offensive and defensive threat for Duke. that Clemson game was one of his down games. I want to see Griffin and Keels both have big impacts here. And I want Duke's big men, Paulo and Mark Williams, and maybe Theo John to a lesser extent, to also assert themselves. I've said that one of the things that Duke should have an advantage in over most teams, before they get to like the Sweet 16 this year, is that Duke has size and physicality that most teams can't match. I want to see them use that to their advantage against Clemson. And like you were saying, Jason, take the crowd out of this game, because that Clemson crowd is notorious against Duke. They will be looking to steal this victory.
One thing that Donald mentioned that we should not overlook, Clemson, like he said, plays North Carolina tonight. They're going to have, barely 48 hours, less than 48 hours from the end of the Carolina game to the start of the Duke game. And without Hunter Tyson, this is a team that is really shallow, really thin. They're going to have to play their starters a lot tonight against the Tar Heels. And I think fatigue could be a real factor for Clemson when playing Duke. That's, it's not often that you say, oh, Duke gets a little scheduling advantage. That could be a little scheduling advantage for the Blue Devils this time.
It's funny that, Duke had, I think, 5 games from the last Clemson game. If I'm remembering this correctly, Duke's had 5 games since the last.
Yeah, it
Clemson
feels like
game.
a long time ago, but for them, it's like nothing.
And for Clemson, it was only 3 games because they're like ACC bye. The hole in their schedule, the intentional hole in their schedule, was right after the first game against Duke. So
we were supposed to have that. We were supposed to have that, but for the rescheduling of the Notre Dame game,
right? And so there's a weird mismatch here of time off. So maybe that's an advantage for Duke, but we will see. So that will do it for episode 388 of the Duke Basketball Report podcast. We will be back after that Clemson game because Duke turns around right after that and goes to Boston College. So we'll be back to talk about BC after the Clemson game. Stay in touch with us, dbrpodcast@gmail.com. Rate, review, subscribe everywhere that you find podcasts. Hopefully you've already done that. We'll talk to you again soon. For Jason Evans and for Donald Wine, I am Sam Klein. This has been episode 388 of the Duke Basketball Report podcast. Duke Band, take us home.